The sun was setting as I, Emily Carter, trudged up the steps to our modest suburban home. The weight of the grocery bags in my arms was nothing compared to the heaviness in my heart. At 29, I had imagined my life differently, but here I was, about to face another evening of scrutiny. As I pushed the door open, the familiar, sterile scent of our living room greeted me. Mark was sitting at the dining table, his back straight as an arrow, his eyes fixated on some papers. He didn't look up as I entered. "Mark, I'm back from the store," I announced, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced up, his eyes immediately falling on the bags in my hands. "Show me what you bought, Emily." His tone was casual, but it carried an undercurrent of command that set my nerves on edge. I hesitated, then placed the bags on the table. Mark began to rummage through them, his brows furrowing with every item he inspected. "We don't need this," he said, discarding a pack of cookies. "Or this," he added, tossing aside a small bottle of scented hand lotion I had bought for myself. I watched in silence, my heart sinking. These were little joys I allowed myself, tiny indulgences in a life that had become increasingly devoid of them. "Mark, why are you doing this?" I finally asked, unable to hide the quiver in my voice. He looked up, his expression one of cold practicality. "We agreed to cut down expenses, Emily. Your little joys aren't essentials." "But they're just small things," I protested weakly. Mark's eyes narrowed. "It's not about the size, Emily. It's about principle. We need to save every penny. I thought you understood that." I felt a surge of anger, mixed with a sense of helplessness. This was not the first time we had this conversation. Since our marriage, Mark's frugality had turned into an obsession. It wasn't just about saving money, it was about control. "Fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll return them." As I repacked the items, Mark went back to his papers, his disapproval hanging in the air like a thick fog. I stood there for a moment, looking at him. This was my husband, a man more concerned about a few dollars than the happiness of his wife. That evening, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, a thought struck me. Mark wanted frugality? I would give him frugality like he'd never seen. A fire ignited within me, a mix of anger and determination. It was time for Mark to experience the life he so rigidly enforced on me. As sleep eluded me, plans began to form in my mind. I would turn his obsession on its head. I would push his frugality to its limits and see how he liked living under the stringent rules he set. It was a risky game, but I was done being the submissive, agreeable wife. Mark had awakened something in me, a spirit of defiance that I never knew I had. And with that realization, a new Emily Carter was born. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a muted glow on the kitchen where I stood, brewing coffee. The sound of Mark's footsteps echoed down the stairs, a daily ritual signaling the start of another day under his watchful eye. "Morning, Emily," he said, his voice devoid of warmth as he glanced at the breakfast table. "Good morning, Mark," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. He sat down, surveying the modest spread of toast and scrambled eggs. His eyes, sharp and calculating, missed nothing. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent war waged at the breakfast table. As Mark ate, his critique began. "You used 3 eggs, we agreed on 2 per meal. And why is there butter on the toast? We need to cut down on luxuries." I clenched my fists under the table, forcing a calm response. "I thought a little change would be nice. I'll remember next time." Mark's gaze was unyielding. "Change is unnecessary. We have a budget for a reason, Emily. You need to stick to it." The meal continued in strained silence. I watched Mark, a mix of resentment and weariness building within me. This was the man I married, a man whose love for numbers and budgets overshadowed everything else, including our relationship. After breakfast, as Mark left for work, he turned to me, his expression stern. "Emily, I expect you to clean the house today. Make sure you do a thorough job." I nodded, biting back a retort. The door closed behind him, and I was left alone in the silent, orderly house that had become my prison. As the day progressed, I cleaned with robotic precision, my mind replaying the years of our marriage. Mark's controlling behavior had gradually escalated, turning our home into a place of rules and restrictions. His obsession with saving and cleanliness overshadowed any semblance of joy or spontaneity. In the midst of my cleaning, I stumbled upon an old photo album. Flipping through it, I saw pictures of a younger, happier us. The The contrast between those carefree days and our current life was stark. Where had things gone so wrong? That evening, as Mark returned, he began his usual inspection of the house. "The windows aren't clean enough. There are streaks," he said, his tone accusatory. I followed him, my heart sinking with each criticism. "I cleaned them twice, Mark." He shook his head, disappointment etched on his face. "Not good enough. You have one job, Emily. It's not that hard." His words stung, a reminder of how little he'd me. I was more than a housekeeper, more than a budget manager. I was a person with dreams and desires, all of which had been suffocated under Mark's relentless need for control. As Mark continued his scrutiny, I knew something had to change. I couldn't live like this anymore. The time for subtle defiance had passed. It was time for bolder actions, time to show Mark the consequences of his unyielding nature. That night I lay in bed planning. Mark wanted a perfectly budgeted, spotless house. I would give him exactly that, but not in the way he expected. The seeds of my plan were taking root, and soon Mark would see just how far his frugality could be pushed. The day was unusually warm, the kind that heralded the end of spring and the onset of a scorching summer. I was in the midst of preparing dinner when my phone buzzed. It was Mark, and his message was curt, "Bringing a friend from work. Be prepared." My heart sank. Not only did this disrupt the carefully planned budget meal, but it also meant catering to an unexpected guest, with Mark's critical eye watching every move. As I scrambled to adjust the meal, I couldn't help but feel a surge of resentment. Mark's impromptu decision, without any consideration for me, was just another example of his controlling nature. The doorbell rang, and I took a deep breath, bracing myself. Mark entered with his colleague, a sharply dressed man named Brian. Introductions were made, and I forced a smile, playing the gracious hostess. Dinner was a tense affair. Brian, oblivious to the undercurrents, praised the meal. Mark, however, had a different agenda. "Emily could have done better if she had more time," he said, a hint of condescension in his voice. "She's still learning to manage the household efficiently." I felt a flush of embarrassment. Mark's words, thinly veiled as constructive criticism, were a public indictment of my capabilities. The humiliation stung, fueling the fire of rebellion within me. As the evening wore on, Mark's critiques grew more pointed. "Emily, why is the living room so cluttered?" he asked, gesturing at the minimal decorations I had put up. "Cluttered," I echoed, my voice a mix of surprise and indignation. "I thought it looked nice." Mark shook his head, his tone patronizing. "You need to understand the difference between decorating and cluttering, Emily. A clean, minimal space is more appealing." Brian, sensing the tension, tried to lighten the mood, but Mark's domineering presence overshadowed his efforts. After Brian left, Mark turned to me, his expression one of disappointment. "You could have done a better job, Emily. You need to be more organized and efficient," he said. His words were the final straw. I had tolerated his controlling behavior for too long, adjusting my life to fit into his rigid, frugal world. But no more. It was time for Mark to understand the consequences of his actions. "I understand, Mark," I said, my voice calm but with an edge that hinted at the storm brewing within. "I'll make sure everything is up to your standards." That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced with plans. Mark wanted efficiency and frugality. I would give him a taste of his own medicine. I would create a home so Spartan, so devoid of any excess, that he would be forced to confront the absurdity of his ways. The next day, I began my mission. Unnecessary items were sold or donated. I stripped the house of anything that Mark could deem superfluous, all under the guise of embracing his philosophy of minimalism and saving. As the house transformed, so did I. Gone was the compliant, subdued Emily. In her place stood a woman determined to fight back, to reclaim her life from the shackles of Mark's oppressive frugality. And as I watched the house become a stark, empty shell, a sense of empowerment grew within me. Mark had awakened a spirit of defiance, and there was no turning back. The transformation of our home into a stark, barren landscape was almost complete. The living room, once cozy and inviting, now echoed with the bareness of its walls and floors. I sold off the decorative lamps, the plush sofa, and even the television, all in the name of frugality. Mark's reaction when he returned home that evening was exactly as I had anticipated, a mix of shock and disbelief. "Emily, what have you done?" he gasped, his eyes scanning the hollowed-out space. I've embraced your philosophy of minimalism and saving, Mark, I said, my voice steady and calm. We don't need these luxuries. We're saving money. But the TV? And the sofa? Mark stuttered, his composure unraveling. They were unnecessary expenses, I replied, echoing his own words. We need to focus on what's essential. The dinner that night was a simple affair, rice and beans, the cheapest meal I could muster. Mark stared at his plate, the realization of his new reality sinking in. This is quite plain, he commented, poking at the beans. It's economical, I said. We're cutting down on food costs, remember? As the days passed, Mark's initial shock gave way to frustration. The absence of his favorite gadgets, the monotony of the meals, and the starkness of our home began to wear on him. Emily, this is too much, he finally said one evening, his patience worn thin. We need some comfort in our lives. This is what you wanted, Mark, I reminded him, a life free of unnecessary expenses. Mark's displeasure grew each day. He missed his comforts, his routines. But I was unyielding. This was my silent rebellion, my way of showing him the extreme consequences of his actions. One evening, as we sat in the uncomfortably empty living room, Mark broke the silence. Emily, I think we need to reassess our situation. This isn't living. I looked at him, a hint of triumph in my eyes. Oh, have you realized that there's more to life than just saving money? Mark's expression softened, a rare moment of vulnerability. Maybe I've been too harsh. We can find a balance. But the damage was done. The resentment and bitterness had taken root in my heart. Mark had awakened a spirit of defiance in me, and there was no going back to the way things were. I'll think about it, I said, my voice devoid of warmth. That night, as I lay in bed, I pondered over the changes in our life. I had set out to teach Mark a lesson, but in doing so, I had also freed myself from the constraints of his oppressive frugality. Mark had hoped to mold me into his ideal frugal wife. Instead, he had unknowingly unleashed a stronger, more independent Emily, and there was no turning back from that. The new normal in our home was anything but comfortable. The drastic changes I had implemented were taking a toll on Mark, and his frustration was palpable. He missed the comforts he had taken for granted, and the simplicity of our meals seemed to be a constant reminder of what he had lost. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, the silence was heavier than usual. Mark pushed the beans around his plate, his appetite clearly affected by the lack of variety. Emily, we need to talk, he said, breaking the silence. I looked up, my expression neutral. What about, Mark? This, he gestured around the bare room, all of this. It's too extreme. We need to find a middle ground. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Mark was finally experiencing the strain of his own stringent rules. I thought you wanted us to save money, I replied. Isn't this what you always wanted? It was, Mark admitted, but not like this. Not at the cost of our comfort and happiness. His words struck a chord in me. For so long I had yearned for him to acknowledge that life was more than just saving money. But now, his realization seemed too little, too late. Maybe we can start by getting some furniture back, Mark suggested hesitantly. I pondered his words, weighing my desire for revenge against the possibility of easing our living conditions. Perhaps, I conceded, but on one condition. What's that? Mark asked, a flicker of hope in his eyes. I took a deep breath, my decision clear. I want a divorce, Mark. The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. Mark's face drained of color, his hope replaced by shock. A divorce? He echoed, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, I said firmly. I can't live like this anymore. I need my freedom, my independence. Mark was silent, the weight of my words sinking in. The man who had once controlled every aspect of our lives was now facing a future he hadn't foreseen. But what about us? He finally asked, a hint of desperation in his tone. There is no us anymore, Mark, I replied, my voice steady. You've shown me that I need more than just a frugal life. I need to be valued, to be happy. The rest of the dinner passed in silence. Mark was lost in his thoughts, and I was resolute in my decision. The path I had chosen was not easy, but it was necessary. I had endured enough under Mark's oppressive frugality, and it was time for me to reclaim my life. As I lay in bed that night, the reality of my decision settled in. I was about to embark on a new journey, one that was uncertain but filled with the promise of freedom. Mark had taught me the value of saving, but in doing so, he had also taught me the value of living. The days following my declaration for a divorce were filled with a strange, tense calm. Mark, once the unyielding enforcer of frugality, now seemed like a shadow of his former self, his usual criticisms and commands noticeably absent. One evening, as we sat in our sparsely furnished living room, Mark broke the silence that had become our constant companion. "Emily, I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, his voice tinged with regret. "I realize now how much I've hurt you, how my obsession with saving has cost us our happiness." I looked at him, surprised by his introspection. "I'm glad you understand, Mark, but it doesn't change how I feel. I need to move on." Mark nodded, a resigned look in his eyes. "I won't contest the divorce," he said quietly, "but I want you to know I truly regret not seeing how my actions affected you." His words, sincere and filled with remorse, gave me no pleasure. Instead, they served as a reminder of what our marriage could have been if things had been different. The divorce proceedings were straightforward, yet each signed document felt like a closing chapter of a book filled with complex emotions. I was gaining my freedom, but the path was lined with remnants of a life that could have been. With the divorce finalized, I found myself standing at the threshold of a new beginning. The house, once a symbol of Mark's stringent rules, was now mine to reinvent. I started slowly, adding small touches that reflected my tastes and personality. But the biggest change was within me. The years of living under Mark's control had instilled in me a sense of determination and resilience I never knew I had. I took up a job at a local bookstore, a place that had always brought me peace and comfort. It was a modest beginning, but it marked the start of my journey towards self-reliance. As I settled into my new life, I often thought about Mark. Despite everything, I hoped he would find his own path to happiness, one not dictated by the rigid confines of frugality. One day, while rearranging the bookshelves at work, a familiar face walked in. It was Mark. He looked different, more relaxed, less burdened. He approached me, a small smile on his face. "Emily, it's good to see you," he said, his voice warm. "You too, Mark," I replied, surprised by the ease of our interaction. "I just wanted to tell you, I've been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of changing," he shared. "I started volunteering at a community center. It's helped me realize there's more to life than saving money." I smiled, genuinely happy for him. "That's great, Mark. I'm glad you found something fulfilling." We chatted briefly about our new lives before Mark left, a sense of closure hanging in the air. As I watched him walk away, I felt a sense of peace. We had both moved on, learning and growing from our shared past. That evening, as I closed the bookstore and walked home, I felt a sense of contentment. Life had thrown challenges my way, but I had emerged stronger and more self-assured. My future was unwritten, a canvas waiting to be painted with the vibrant colors of new experiences and opportunities, and I was ready to embrace it all. Months had passed since my divorce from Mark, and life had settled into a new, comfortable rhythm. The bookstore job had become more than just a means to an end. It was a place where I found joy and purpose. One day, as I was organizing the latest arrivals, a familiar face appeared among the shelves. It was Mark, looking more at ease than I had ever seen him. "Emily," he greeted, a tentative smile on his face. "Mark," I replied, a bit taken aback by his unexpected visit. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, looking around at the books. "I just wanted to see how you were doing." "I'm doing well," I responded, my tone guarded yet polite. "And you?" "I've been better," he admitted. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since our divorce, about how I treated you, about everything." His words caught me off guard. It was rare for Mark to acknowledge his faults so openly. "I've realized I was wrong, Emily," he continued. "I was so focused on saving money that I lost sight of what truly mattered. I lost you." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but it did little to stir the old feelings I once had for him. Too much had happened, too much had changed. "Mark, I appreciate your apology," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But I've moved on. The life we had together is in the past." He nodded, a look of understanding crossing his face. "I know, and I'm not here to ask for a second chance. I just wanted you to know that I regret my actions. You deserved better." We talked for a while, reminiscing about the good times and acknowledging the bad. It was a conversation that brought closure, a final acknowledgement of our shared history and the separate paths we were now on. As Mark left the bookstore, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was the closing of a chapter, the end of a story that had shaped me in ways I never expected. Standing among the rows of books, I realized how far I had come, from the timid, subdued wife to a woman who had reclaimed her independence and strength. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. I closed the bookstore that evening with a sense of accomplishment and optimism. The future was mine to write, a blank page waiting to be filled with new stories, new experiences. As I walked home under the starlit sky, I thought about what lay ahead. There would be challenges, of course, but I felt ready to face them. For the first time in a long time, I was truly excited about what the future held. Life had taught me that change was inevitable, but it was how we responded to that change that defined us. I had chosen to rise above the struggles, to forge a path that was true to who I was. And as I turned the key to my apartment, stepping into a space that was entirely my own, I knew that the best was yet to come.